So tonight's speaker is David Dockterman. He is a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the designer of dozens of award-winning educational technology programs. Tonight he'll be giving a presentation on how technology can support personalized learning in different contexts for different individuals and groups. So David, I'll leave it up to you.
Awesome. Okay. Do I need the mic? Am I okay without the mic? Yeah, right, okay. Okay, some people have water, some people have other things. It's really fun. Somehow I'm reminded, most of you are too young, when there was something called the Boston Computer Society, and people gathered, but it was, hopefully you'll get this big, this meetup will get this big, but in the early 80s, we did a thing for the Boston Computer Society called the cursor construction set. The making of a cursor construction set. And I'm not going to dig anymore. That was just so funny. Anyway, so here's what I wanted to do, my tentative plan here. Tentative because I wasn't sure about this, but I wanted to give you a little historical perspective on this concept of personalization and individualization and smart AI, adaptive learning, whatever it is, but a little historical perspective. Kind of break down a framework for thinking about the multiple ways that learners differ. Give you offer a framework for thinking about developing a smart learning system. And it's a work in progress, so hopefully you will be giving me comments and asking questions throughout. That's the plan. Is that cool? Yes. It's really a rhetorical question, but okay. So here we go. So it's interesting. You're talking about this whole concept of personalized learning, and the idea in many places. I've been visiting a bunch of schools. They're talking about we're going to be competency-based. There's no reason we all have to move together. We're going to be smart about what individual students need. And it's cool. We had that about 200 years ago when public education first started more or less in the world and in this country. We did not have the kind of system we have today. We actually had a system called the monitorial system, developed mostly by this guy Joseph Lancaster in London, who relocated to Baltimore, I think. And so the early schools were one-room schoolhouses that might have 30, 150 students. And the way it worked was, every student who came in, you'd say, well, Leslie, you're this level in reading, and you're this level in writing, and you're this level in arithmetic. I'm going to put you in with other students who are like you. And Lancaster developed these learning progressions for these different places, and different students got placed, and so it was totally competency-based. And however long it took Leslie to move up, to get to the next level, that's how long it took. If you went fast, you went fast. You went slow, you went slow. Didn't matter how old you were, that's the way it was organized. And they actually used more competent students as what they called monitors to help manage that. So they had a competency-based, peer-supported learning system. And you had, the teacher would work with small groups of students who would come up. Now, the pedagogy was pretty rigid. You do recitations. It wasn't constructivist or very engaging necessarily, but you had a competency base. It was very personalized around what students knew and could do. And so it was kind of cool. That's how it was. And recognizing that there would be other kinds of issues. So when you started organizing people by what they knew and could do, sometimes you might have an older student with a bunch of younger ones. And that might feel discouraging. So the guy Lancaster wrote about, well, how do you handle that when you see students are discouraged? Or this one, I love this, a boy named Henry was once allured into bad company. Like, I just love that language. He's got this great story about this kid, Henry, who got mixed up with kids who weren't so academically minded, and he made all these suggestions about using really gamification techniques to get the kid back into learning and to motivate him, and different ways to use social pressure in positive ways. It's like, wow, this is really incredible. This is 200 years ago. Go on, like what happened, right? And so this system actually existed, particularly in rural schools, well into the 19th century. But in big urban schools, where you had lots of kids, when you started organizing them based on what they knew in all these different domains, you ended up with a teacher managing 50 to 60 different groups. And it just became unwieldy. So we need a different organizing principle. Let's organize kids by how old they are. And they started that in urban settings. Because think about how hard it is, right? The notion that we're going to educate everybody, but we only have a few resources, teachers, to do it, how do you set it up? Recognizing, they always recognized that learners were different. But it's really hard. And they started this, 200 years ago. They went to, let's organize by age. And so they did this age-graded school systems, which have come to dominate everything. And the expectation was that most 10-year-olds were about the same. And in 1916, Elwood Cubberley, who would become the dean of the Stanford School of Education, he's not there anymore. It's a little joke. I'm going to explain it. It's not that good. But he expected that most of those kids would, like 70% would move together. 15% would be retarded. That was the term that they used then. They would be slow. And 15% would be, one of the terms he used was supernormal. But of course, when you looked at the data, and the superintendents of these schools in the early 20th century were very data-driven. You looked at the data, you hardly ever got 70% of the people moving together. It didn't really work out that way. And then students who were held back, they felt bad, so you had this whole thing about social promotion. You got these same sort of mix of issues trying to figure it out. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was this whole other wave of going back to these kinds of ungraded schools, but it's complicated. And so maybe today it's different, maybe, but I want you to think about for a second, what are the things that we're trying to do, and what are the different things that kind of get in the way or make learning successful? So just take like 60 seconds to swap stories. You're a storyteller, you can just say a story. He is a storyteller. Swap stories about a time you tried to learn something and you got it, and a time you tried to learn something and you gave up. And what's the difference? Right? So it's a little turn and talk. So like 90 seconds. Let's see what you got. Go.
Okay, so time that I tried to learn something and I
and then quickly interrupt you. I don't have that much time. And so I'm so curious. So what did you guys talk about? What was that? This is really what we get questioned about. This is so good.
Well, we both said we tried to learn the language and we gave up. Another language.
Well, it was French.
We both tried to learn French and gave up?
Yeah.
So how come? Does that mean everything? What happened? No, what happened? Like why? What happened?
Just challenging. Too challenging.
Too challenging. And so what was something that you didn't give up on? That you got, like you did, and you was like, I'm gonna get this. Or you haven't learned anything.
Well, we
Yeah.
actually had a harder time coming up with something that we gave up on, because we felt like most things we kind of saw through and we eventually learned it in
Yeah.
some way.
Some way. Some things easier than others?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But so what about a hard thing? Can you tell us about a hard thing? Shannon, I'm sorry to pick on you.
That's
but
okay.
you just
I wasn't all that
happened to
great
be
in
there.
mathematics, but eventually you gotta learn it, right, to
Yeah.
get through.
And so what did you do to sustain yourself? Like, how come you didn't give that up?
Because I needed it to graduate
Because
college.
all right, so here's so some things, we all have times that we've given up things, and other times that we've been really engaged in it. And when you look at it, for each time, you might be a different reason why you stuck with something. I liked it, I had to, I didn't have to, and it was hard, so I quit. Okay, so maybe it wasn't worth it. So this is where, to understand that we vary. Humans vary, so learners vary. It's just inevitable. There's lots of variation. And lots of reasons why learning happens and why it doesn't happen. And I'm going to use a organizing principle from the world of universal design for learning. People are familiar with CAST. Somebody here is working, I know at least one person here that is working more than that. Okay. So the idea that there are these, sort of, let's loosely call them these, talk about these learning networks, the what network, the how network, and the why network. And this is not exactly the way these networks are defined, but it's close. So we can think about the what network as the stuff of learning. Right? These are the things we want you to know. I'll call it cognitive, but cognitive, what isn't cognitive, but whatever. But this is some content, knowledge and skills, and access to that content. So there's that piece. Then there's the metacognitive piece, it's the how part, the management of the learning process. So here's stuff I need to learn. French, math, there's content there, and then there's the management of that. It's like, okay, how am I going to learn this? I'm going to study, and then I'm going to test myself. I'm just going to put it over my head while I'm sleeping, whatever it is, right? And then so all these sort of self-regulation, maybe there's a group piece to this as well. So there's the management part, the how part, and then there's it's worth it, it's not worth it. The engagement part. I don't care enough about this, and I'm using here a framework from the Mindset Learning Network. So these are mindset scholars. So you've got growth mindset is one. I believe I can learn. If I don't believe it's worth learning, French isn't worth it, maybe I'm not going to stick with it. It has purpose, it has value for me. There are lots of things that can give it purpose. I need it, and then I want it. Those are two different things. And then there's the belief that I can do it. It's French. I'm never going to learn French, right? And even if I do, I'm going to sound so bad. My accent is so bad. So this belief, that's growth mindset belief. And then often you need this other belief, because if something is hard, you're likely not to get it right away. You're going to stumble. And that can be embarrassing. So you need to believe that it's okay to learn things that don't come easily to you. That there's a group that's going to support you and help you along the way. That I belong. That nobody's going to laugh at me. I'm not going to be humiliated because I can't get it right away. So we have all of these things that can impact. And it might be, a lot of times the reason for not learning is this. The reason why you get up is this part. Now, it could be, I have so much to learn to be able to do this. I don't know that I can, but ultimately it comes back to all these pieces kind of working together. So when we talk about supporting students, learners, actually, then it gets harder because these variables are fluid. Yeah, sometimes you hear about we're going to do a learner profile. But learner profiles, so who are you as a learner? You keep learning new things and forgetting things you knew. So you can't get a profile that's static of what you know and can do. That's constantly changing. And then people are different. I know, most of you can think more readily back to college than I can, because there was a lot of drugs, but also, where I can't focus in the dorm, I have to go to the library. And that's sort of a process of learning. For me, we spent 8 years on Ritalin for a variety of reasons. Not in college. This is before college. I don't want you to think it's like, well, that's how, yeah. No, this was medicinal, not recreational. Like I couldn't work in the library, it was too quiet. I needed distraction. So we're different in terms of, we're different in those ways. The social context matters. Sometimes it's like, I'm not, you know how you sit like this because you don't want to look bad in front of other people, but sometimes when you're with your friends, you're willing to do really stupid things and fail. So the social context matters as well. So you have all these things that are varying in terms of what a learner, what's going to drive learning and support learning. It's like, this is crazy. So if we want to make an intelligent system, how do we monitor all this stuff? In the 1960s, there was an approach called Aptitude Treatment Intervention, ETI, developed by these guys, Snow and Kronbach. And it was kind of like, by aptitude, they meant like everything. Psychological issues, what you knew and didn't know, environmental issues, somebody's hungry, somebody's anxious about a parenting thing on a daily basis, all this stuff. And when they tried to match up, it's like you go to the doctor and say, I have a headache. We don't treat the, like, well, why? Right? It's like, take 2 aspirin. That might work for you, but it might not work for somebody else, because why do you have a headache? Why aren't you paying attention? So you're trying to match up, and they basically said, it's insane. It's just too many variables. It's just incredible. So what do we do with all these issues that can impact learning? How do we manage that? And so here I want to provide a framework for thinking about that, trying to make it a little more reasonable. And one is, start by anticipating the variables that will matter the most. So, right, and most of that is contextual. So this is actually, is the Cu-Chi tunnels in Vietnam? Am I saying that right? Right, so these are tunnels, these little tunnels built by the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And I was traveling with some friends, including this colleague named Leah, who's very petite. And for the task of crawling around the tunnels, small was great. That was an important characteristic. So for me, I took the picture and let her go down there. Right? So context matters. What characteristics matter for this task and for this kind of learning and these learners, right? And so what do we use to inform what we should anticipate? If we can't build anything unless we anticipate what we're going to need. You can't build how to help a student who's struggling without anticipating. Like, what do I do? I got to anticipate that there are these needs coming. So I can anticipate things on the website, which is where most of sort of adaptive learning is. We're trying to be smart. We're going to be smart about kids know this skill and not that skill. And there are these learning progressions or standards. And there's an assumption that this leads to this, leads to this, or this was taught before that. And so we can look, where are you? And maybe that'll help. There's research on common errors and misconceptions. And we can also do a task analysis. Does this task, like crawling around the tunnels, mean that height matters? And if you're tall, how do we support that? If this is one where it's like you really have to, you're going to interpret a graph, well, what if I can't see the graph? Right? But being able to see matters for interpreting a graph. And I don't know if you've ever used Desmos before, but they have this cool thing where the graph, they have a blind programmer. And the blind, it's awesome. Like Eli Lubroff is the founder of Desmos. It's a very cool online graphing tool. Tells the story about being in a call, in a video call with his blind programmer who's working off site. And it's like, I can't see you. And the programmer says, everything's working. It's like, oh wait, I got to turn the light on. Because he's working in the dark. He doesn't know that the light's off. And he wanted to make the graph something that he could use, even though he couldn't see it. And so their graphs you can turn on, and it plays a song. It plays music. And each, as it changes, as it goes to negative, and when it crosses the axes, and it's like, cool. So what matters, and how do I make that accessible? So we can think about those things. And then we got to think about, well, the how part. Like, so what kinds of metacognitive or learning process issues might get in the way? And we can look at, there are students who are on IEPs. So if you assume that we're all along multiple spectrums, we're all on the spectrum somewhere, on multiple spectrums. So the kids that we've identified who are further out, who have emotional or cognitive or metacognitive needs, then we can begin to identify what are we doing for them and can those help? This is really very much a UDL kind of approach, that the things we do for kids on the margins might be really beneficial for learners who are more closer to the middle. So what can we do here to support those? There will also be progressions like through CASEL and social emotional learning. And then the Y part, to look at the culture and the context. So if you're in a community that's high performing, where everybody's driven, where people are well fed and come from fairly stable families, you might anticipate different needs than if you're one that's high poverty, where kids get afraid by the walk to school. That those are different kinds of emotional needs to anticipate. So let's not try and do everything for everybody, but let's think about the task, the content, the learners, what can we anticipate? And it's cool, we end up with these maps, just to give you a sense, there's this stuff that's out there. These are basically the standards of practice for science, math, and ELA. It's like, well, here's a set of behaviors that we expect kids to be able to do. Are they able to do these? What's that? You can go, here's more of a progression through a set of kind of learning-related behaviors, SEL kinds of things. I love the stuff. I don't know if people know CREST. It's a research and evaluation group at UCLA, and they love making ontologies, maps of knowledge. This one, which in my spring course on adaptive learning, students were like, this is a rifle marksmanship. And so when you map out a skill domain, then you can start to say, well, here are the precursors, and these things are related, and if you can't do this, then let's work our way back. But you end up having to have a map, because you have to know where to go. So you have all this stuff, and then once you have decided what to anticipate, you have to look for it. You have to now pay attention for it. You have to notice it, detect it. I don't know if people, you know the invisible gorilla video, right? I don't have time to show it. But this is a thing where they show a video and they ask you to count how many times the ball is passed. And people are counting, and about half the people, if they've never done this before, will miss that a person in a gorilla suit walks across the stage in the middle of them passing the ball and goes to the other side. And even if you see that, you probably don't see that somebody leaves and the curtain changes color. So this is it. We notice what we pay attention to. Anticipation allows us to focus. What matters? Let's pay attention to these things. So we want to focus. Now, how do we notice? We have people, right? Then we have people who notice it, and people are actually really good at noticing things that it takes machines a long time to do. Some things machines can notice, but we're all pattern recognizing. The brain is all built to do pattern recognitions. AI is all about pattern recognitions. And we can think about what are the detection systems. There's this whole area of affect detection, affective computing. There's all kinds of things. I can measure people's heart rates. I can look at their faces. That's a confused face. That's a frustrated face. That's a I'm asleep face. So we have these different ways, but ultimately maybe what we want is to help the learner notice themselves. I'm going to come back to that, because this is ultimately right. It's like, yes, I can notice this. Can I help the learner see it themselves? And sometimes this is informing this, but we have lots of different means of gathering information, and then we have to respond. But we want to respond in a way that's effective. If we're trying to personalize, if we're trying to meet individual needs, and so it's not just let me try this, it's like what might work? And there are tools out there like Digital Promise has this nice research map, which is a starting point to think about what kinds of interventions or actions might be helpful. And then, what do we do? For different things, we lay it out. Here's what we're going to do. If we see this, then we do that within the different domains. But you know what? You're going to have to make choices. Because you can't do everything. So the whole idea of anticipating is like, let's do as much as we can and make sure we're at least making sure that people have access to the learning, anticipating those sort of accessibility needs. And then how do we respond? I want to give you 3 kind of ways to think about responses. One is the automated one, right? I'm going to build smart software. It's going to know that you missed these vocabulary words, so I'm going to give you these spelling words. I'm going to give you these words, right? I know you've missed these math problems. I'm going to give you practice on those math problems. So there's an automated one that's driven by an algorithm. Hopefully it's a smart one, but maybe not. And then I'm going to call it a hybrid one, where you get information that's collected that you now give to the teacher. I'll call it augmented adaptivity. This is from Summit Schools. We've got all this information, we're identifying, you know what? Maybe as the teacher, here's something I can do for this kid. So you think about automated, hybrid, helping the teacher or somebody else be more responsive to individual needs, and then a manual one. Right? I don't know how many of you used GPS to get here, right? But I did. And then when a GPS is an example of a system that gives the user control. It's not deciding for you, this is the best thing for you. It's like, for me, for right now, I want the map, but once I get close, I want the list. Or I want the list, and once I get close, I want the map. And I'm going to go back and forth to give the learner control. And what we're trying to do, constantly, is help the learner get better. To think about these adaptive systems, what we're trying to do, whatever it is, to inform the learner in being better able to manage themselves, right? To help the learner be more adaptive. And then be delighted when your system screws up, right? Because you're going to be wrong. The nice thing about anticipation is that now you're really primed to see something you didn't expect. I built this thing anticipating that people would need it, but nobody needs it. Well, let's get rid of that. I didn't anticipate this, and it's like, well, let's have a system that's constantly learning. Anticipate directs us to notice and respond, and then we want to give that feedback back. You know what? We should be looking for this, or it was wrong to look for that. The system needs to get smarter and smarter, and tap not just this complex data you're collecting through the machine, because you know what? That's pretty artificial. If all you're doing is tracking learning that kids do when they're on a device, you're missing all the learning they do away from the device. Tap the collective wisdom of the people in the system. Both the teachers, the observers, and the learners themselves. Let that feed this system to help it get smarter. That's it. That was it. Right, that's it. It's a smarter system, and I'm only over 2 minutes. So I'm happy to comments, questions, whatever. Is that cool? Okay?
The good news is we left you plenty of time for questions because we knew there were going to be a lot of them. So who wants to go first if the microphone works?
So I can just ask like this. One of the things is, in the map that you showed, that's a pretty simple thing. But when especially you're in education at a university, how much do you want the students to see?
Oh, right. Oh, so it's a great question. If you want people to become owners of their own learning, they have to have that path. They have to know where they're headed, where they came from. Otherwise, it's really tough for them to take ownership. Otherwise, you're just waiting to be told. So I think you want to expose that. You want them to see, here are the skills we're working on. Here's why we're working on. Here's the next thing that we're going to work on. It's leading toward this. One of the great ways to motivate people is to help them see themselves making progress. If every skill is in isolation, if everything you're learning is just, I learned this thing, okay, all right, now I'm learning another thing. When you're learning French, or trying to, right, one of the things that drives you, or doesn't, is that you see yourself getting better, right? And it's like one of the things that's discouraging is, I keep trying, it's like I sound like crap, and I like nobody. I'm not getting any vocabulary. So I think you have to make the learning transparent if you want learners to have ownership of it.
So wouldn't that basically break down our entire school system? Because you basically go through 4 years of school, until you don't graduate school, you don't realize where you've learned. Like I've learned integration and differentiation. During school, I've not used it for any time of my, or for a lot of time after school. So wouldn't it be much better that if you learn something, you apply it then itself, and then you learn something, rather than...
So, yeah, so well, this gets into pedagogy. I mean, it's another whole other conversation, right, about like how you engage people in learning, and that the part of the moving forward is I'm now able to do something I couldn't do before. What can I do? Rather than just, hey, I can now do this thing that I don't care about. Now there's another thing I can do that I don't care about. Part of what fuels the motivation is that I want to learn, to give reason, right? It's like, I have to believe this is worth doing. So there are a bunch of different ways to do that. One way is to try and make it applicable, but most things we learn in school aren't. At least not clearly applicable. And it's like, believe me, you'll need to know how to, figure the volume of a cube someday. Okay, maybe not. But there are other ways to make things meaningful. So that's an element of it, right? And it's like, if it's not meaningful, what do I do to make it meaningful? One way is potentially to make it more applicable. So it's part of the system, right? If some people are just like, I love learning this stuff, go for it. But somebody else might need more practical window into it. Can I just call on people?
Oh, yeah.
Lindsay.
Yes, for my name.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of ways you kind of get a student to think about how they think about something. Because there's a bunch of ways sort of induce this metacognitive
Yeah.
strategy of the different ways that you have thought of. Of course, there's like a billion different ways. Which ways have you found most effective, and how do you go about comparing sort of the effectiveness? Because one way might be to sort of walk a student through that process, like this is how you could think about your own thinking. Or one way could be put them in a situation which they're bound to make a mistake, and then you learn from your mistake. So what are the best ways to promote metacognitive thinking in the first place?
Okay, so if one of the goals, which I believe it is to build sort of the behaviors, the ability to manage your own learning, you do need to define what those skills are. And you want to do that, I believe, with intention. So part of this is sort of matching the task. So let's say I want to build, so one is build reflection into the system, reflecting on my learning, and that reflection might expose that, wow, you tackled it this way, Steve did it another way, I wonder if that way would work for me, to build that into the sort of learning pattern, particularly when you're in a social situation, which I think is great. But then if you want to build like strategies for when you get stuck, right? It's like there's persistence. They talk about persistence and resilience. Resilience is how well you bounce back from failure, and persistence is your ability to pursue something that's hard. So if I want to work on persistence, I have to have a task that's probably too hard for you. Otherwise, there's no persistence. So again, it's with intent to build this behavior. There's like, is metacognition a behavior? Right? It's kind of, but ultimately, if you want to help people do it, you have to coach them through that. And so you want to build that. You want to do it, I believe, with intention. You're not waiting, for, oh, you're stuck. Let's focus on persistence. I want to be able to call up persistence when you get stuck. Remember when we were all trying to do this thing? It was just really hard, and then people were looking up different strategies. And then they were turning to each other, that there were all these help-seeking strategies that we employed to help you learn how to persist. And so you need to define these things. This is one of the more nebulous areas. We're pretty good at defining the what and the content and the skills. This stuff you're supposed to remember and you're supposed to be able to do. We're in process, we collectively, with things around social emotional learning, which is often the umbrella that captures those kinds of characteristics. But you don't want to wait for it. You don't want to wait for them, whoever they are, to figure it out. But let's pick some and be intentional. That?
It was a really broad question, yes.
Yeah. Well, and then how do I do each thing? But I think there are different ways to do it, but you can't do it if you haven't defined it. Yes.
So my name is Eleni Mitsakai, and I'm very engaged and involved in this endeavor of personalized learning. And I want to kind of take a step back a little bit.
Sure.
So we've been talking about how to get the student to be motivated or to be engaged or to, and kind of all of that.
Right.
Assuming that the student is not all of that. And so we're trying to bring them from a state of disengagement to a state of engagement. And I'm wondering the following, like when we are born, right? And we enter life, we're super engaged. So how about, instead of thinking how to move from disengagement to engagement, to think about how to keep the initial engagement, right? So when a child enters the world, we don't have to tell the child go and explore, right? So they're curious to touch things, they're curious to try things. We don't have to tell them to do these things, they just do them, right? And then something happens, and they kind of stop doing them. So maybe it would be worth thinking, instead of thinking about very complex maps of knowledge and how to move from step 1 to step 2, right? Because if you don't want to be in those steps, who cares if you have them in the right order or not? To start thinking a little bit, well, at what point does that kid that wanted to learn, that was enjoying learning that, reading that book or exploring something in the environment, stop being engaged? So I'm thinking, how would you, and the way that I'm thinking about it is, well, maybe if we find a way of letting the kid develop, and let the kid engage with the things that he or she wants to engage with, instead of moving them. And I hope there are parents here. You watch your own kids, right? They go to school and very excited. My kids definitely were very excited, and then at some point there's too much homework, and then you have to learn this and you have to learn that, and then something breaks there. So I'm thinking of personalized learning as a way of keeping the learner engaged by letting them explore, giving the resource, whatever they need, so they continue to learn, rather than trying to fix the problem after the problem has occurred.
Right.
You see where I'm going with that?
No, I think so. The problem is the problem has occurred, so you can't pretend that it isn't there. The best thing to do is to start as early as possible to build and sustain engaged, curious learners. However, it's not clear that the pause in the seeking isn't a natural thing. We are born incomplete. We're born before we're ready to exist in the world, right? And so like other animals, mammals, they're born and they're like, I'm off, I'm done, right? Human babies need a lot of care. And so it's really interesting, and there are a lot of theories out there about, I don't think it's fair to compare kindergartners to adults. One of the things that happens as we mature, we're exploring. I mean, we're kind of wired to explore, but then we build schema to make the world efficient for ourselves, to make cognition much more efficient. I don't Sir Ken Robinson does that thing where it's like, look at how kindergartners are so fascinated by a paperclip and adults aren't. And what did we do to them? It's like, well, I know what a paperclip, kindergarten, they know what a paperclip is, right? It's not really a fair comparison. It's like, my brain is so much more efficient that I don't have to wonder what a paperclip is. I can wonder about something I've never seen before. And so there are questions about how much of that sort of natural curiosity you can sustain. And then what you're describing is like, I need to take into account everything, not just the school environment, but the parental environment and all the rest. All the different kinds of cultures that influence an individual's willingness to explore. And within any population, there are individuals who are more willing to take risks than others. So it's not like everybody is born the same kind of excitement and willingness to go explore. And can I tell it the fish sex research?
Sure.
Is that okay? So I don't want to take, I don't know, but it's
Go ahead. It's on, you're being filmed, so go ahead.
Yeah, so it's not my research, but I find it it's just, so these guys were looking at risk-taking. And so they were looking at fish, and in any population that they've studied of social animals, right? So fish, they're social groups. There are individuals within that group that are more willing to kind of be adventurous than others. So they set up a thing that's like this dark tunnel, and they looked to see which fish would go down the tunnel. And there were some that did and some that didn't. And then they set up another thing, they call it predator investigation. There's this shadowy thing out there. Will it eat us? You go look, right? And so they watched the fish, and the same fish that went down the tunnel were the same ones that would go out to investigate, right? Others are hanging back, which totally makes sense, right? Because if everybody went to investigate and got eaten, you'd be gone. So you need somebody, it's like, you try it, if you don't die, I'll have some. So there's that kind of variety in terms of the, you know, you see that in humans, you see it in any kind of social population. Now the key, what they were interested in was, there's clearly a benefit to the group to have individuals who go out and be foragers, find new food, find new places to live. You need that. But those are, by nature, high-risk kinds of activities, because you're going out into unknown. So what the researchers were curious about, well, what do those risk takers get? So it's a clear benefit to the group to have people who are going out to the frontier. What does that individual get? So they watch the fish, and what those fish that went and like investigated the predator, what they got was fish sex. Like a lot of fish. And I don't care what you're thinking, it's not that interesting. But they got more fish sex than the brightly colored fish, right? And sort of like bright, because a lot of what we, you know, in nature, it's all about I'm a good mate, right? We're trying to sustain ourselves, sustain the species. And so risk-taking is actually a valuable feature. Now the thing was, those fish would not swim out to investigate the predator unless the other fish were watching. Right? Because there's no benefit to them in the group. And it sort of explains, it's like status matters. I'm trying to show off risk-taking behavior. And you know, from an evolutionary perspective, rewarding that, keeping that risk-taking characteristics in the gene pool, it makes sense that you are just drawn to have sex with those risk-taking fish, because you need to keep that, they're the most at risk from disappearing. So there's variety. How did I get on that story? There's variety, and it's challenging to do what you're saying, but clearly, there was just some other reason. The earlier we start, the better. And the more we're able to sustain it, the better. But the truth is, there's so many different environments that kids are in that they grow up in that are either feeding their interest and passion about learning, and ones that squash it. And they go through different phases. It's like, my friends aren't interested in that either, right? And it's like, no matter what you've done, there are all these other forces that are acting on people's lives. You know, do the best we can to have that be something that's built in from the beginning. Recognize there can be pressures to pull them away from that. But I'm with you, let's do it early. I'd rather not have to fix stuff.
There's one more way of looking at that, maybe it's simpler, and that is, you can think of personalized learning as a process whereby, and I think a lot of the system is going that way to my dismay, you can think of personalized learning as, I want you to get to X, and I need to figure out how you're going to get to X. I'm going to try this way, I'm going to try the other way, but I need you to know X. And I think a lot of the adaptive learning literature is about how can I get you to X?
Oh, yeah.
Personalized learning is about what X do you want to define for yourself?
So, yeah, so let me rephrase it, because I think we're in agreement. I think most of the stuff is narrowly focused on content, knowledge, and skills. And let's make sure you get them, because that's what we're tested on, and that's the, you know, their standards and all that stuff. But ultimately, we want to turn people into, I would call it, voracious and tenacious learners. Right? That's what we want. How do we do that? And part of it is, I don't think most kids know what they're interested in until, I mean, it's still complicated. It isn't kind of like, the research is pretty clear. When you open up and say, you figure it all out, that does not work. So you're talking about creating situations to feed interests, to open up new interests that most kids don't, like, what does a third grader know about what they want to do yet? Right? And so you want to feed those things, but I think the goal is people who are insatiable learners. That's the goal. So that, I think we're talking about the same thing. I'm totally with you, which is why I say, that really you're feeding into helping people become expert learners in their own right. I'm with you.
We have
Yes.
time for one more question, so this will be the last one.
Okay.
Okay.
But I'll hang around.
It seems like our school system is developed in a way that most people, by the time they get high school, they don't remember a lot of stuff they learned, and a lot of stuff they learned, they don't really know why. It seems like countries like Canada and Finland have just such better scores on everything. What are they doing differently that their students are succeeding more?
So
What are other countries like Finland and Canada doing so much better than America that we can do differently? And if it's not, no, it's true though. And if is it personalized learning? Is it saying, hey, you know what? You don't have to learn this. You could become a tradesman. You could become a welder. You don't have to learn the physics. You know, maybe that's better for society. I'm just wondering what are they doing differently, and why can't we just do what they're doing?
Yeah, why can't we? so this is complicated in many ways. So one issue is like by what measure, right? But if you read Amanda Ripley's book, where she followed the transfer students, I forget the name of the book. Smartest Kids in the World, right? And one of the things that is so poignant is where in Finland, like one of the reasons that the girl who left Oklahoma and went to Finland, in Oklahoma, she was like, I'm excited about school. And her friends were like, what? There's cheerleading practice. There's football game. What do you care about school? And she went to Finland and she asked the kids in Finland, why do you guys care about school? Do you guys care about school? And they looked at her like, what do you mean? Like, education is everything. They don't have all the extracurriculars, right? They're not, it is about this, and the culture values it so heavily. So it's not a simple answer. What can we do? Let's be more like them? Culturally? Like, we'll all be cold and you know, so it's a complicated kind of thing. And there are, even though we may look in envious ways at other countries who have higher scores, they often look at us and say, why can't we be more creative? And so it's not that clear cut. But I do think there is a cultural issue around the value of education in the United States that is not true universally. And that matters. So I guess I'm done. Thank you for your time.
Alright, so we're going to get into some closing announcements. The first thing I'm going to do is remind everybody that if you have not entered the raffle yet, you have about 3 more minutes. So now would be the time to do that. Just right over there. What is the prize? Yes, there is a raffle. What is the prize over in the corner?
We have an Echo Dot and an Echo Show. Come on over.
I'm glad to see I made that announcement because it looks like there were some people who have not entered yet.